Well, on to one of our first guests, Kate Johnson. Kate holds a BA in Sociology and a Bachelor of Social Work from Lakehead University. Kate also holds a Master of Divinity with a concentration in Restorative Justice from the former Queen's Theological College. Kate has spent her career advocating for the marginalized and encouraging victim survivors to realize their potential for post-traumatic growth. Thank you, Kate, for being with us.
Thanks for the invitation. And thanks to CCJC in a big way for figuring out a way to get some research money and to continue this work. So I'm going to tell you the whole story in brief, but it's been an amazing challenge. It's been an amazing challenge in a time when supposedly we're more focused on the needs and issues around victims to find a way to make this work happen and to have it continue. So that's something that I hope to illuminate for you today. But CCJC has just been there and wrote all the grant proposals and done everything they needed to do to make this happen. And I'm grateful for that, and I'm grateful that we get to talk to all of you about it today. So I was the chaplain at Pittsburgh Institution for 5 years, and at one point, partway through my time there, one of the men came back from a judicial review. So for those who don't know, that a faint hope hearing, it's commonly known in the public, in the layperson's talk. He was 17 years into his sentence, and at the time of his crime, victims had an even more limited place in the criminal justice system than they do now. It was really just at the beginning of all of that stuff. And there had been no victim impact statement at his original trial. So then he went to his judicial review, and for the first time in his life, really heard from his victims. Really heard from his victims. When he came back from that experience, he said to me, and it's a little unbelievable given that he'd done a murder and all that kind of stuff, but people have a lot of cognitive distortions to get them to the point of the crime. And then when they get to prison, typically they're very focused on their own circumstances and surviving their own circumstances. So it may seem unbelievable that for 17 years he had not fully grasped the weight of what he had done, but yet that was the case. So he comes back from the judicial review, and he says to me, if I had heard from my victims, really heard from my victims before this happened, I never would have asked for judicial review. I would not have put them through that. I would have been happy to serve my 25, and like, I get it now, why they need me to be here, and I have a different sense of what I can do for them. And then he said, I think there's an awful lot of guys in this place who need to understand that stuff. So can you help us? Can you help us understand the victim's point of view? And of course, for a restorative justice person, my answer was absolutely yes. We're going to find a way for me to do that. But also because I'm an incredibly busy chaplain in a increasingly crowded institution, it would be really great if we could find this program in a box. So one of the other guys, one of his friends, came to work for me as my restorative justice researcher. And he wrote to organizations all over the country and North America to see if we could find a program. And an organization in Ottawa gave us the name of You Have the Power. And we looked into it, found out that it cost $1,000, asked the Correctional Service of Canada for $1,000 to run this program. My salary's already paid, just give us $1,000. Nope. Couldn't do it, couldn't figure out which budget line it was going to come out of. Maybe we'll do it later, keep reminding us. Trust me, I did. 2 people promised to get me the program. One of them followed through. So the regional chaplain at the time, many months after me asking for the money, he was able to get me the money in March Madness, and we bought the program. And I started running it the following April. I would have been super stoked if I'd had 20 guys sign up and 10 guys finish. That was like my dream. I had 50 guys sign up and 48 guys finish. Yeah, it was amazing. Yay, guys, right? They actually really wanted this material. So it kind of blew me away that this was the way it was. They were just really, really deeply engaged. And I'll tell you something that I think makes a difference for this in the program. When You Have the Power first started this, they had a very much a victim's mindset, which makes sense, or victim's organization. And they were going to go into prison and or my understanding is they were going to go into prison and present the victim's point of view in what I understand was a fairly one-sided way. But when they got in there, they realized how many people in prison have been victims themselves. And so they needed to adapt the program to be kind of two-pronged. Not only are we going to challenge you to understand your victim's experience and to take some accountability for that, but we're going to present this material in a way that has compassion for the reality that many of you were victims too, and that you need a way to own some of that stuff and deal with some of that stuff and take responsibility for both pieces, what you've done and your own experience of victimization and how that's affecting you. So this is not what my husband calls a pokey chest program, right? We're not going in and telling them what they've done. We're talking to them about what's happened to them and the consequences of that for themselves and the people around them. Now, of course, there are guys who were not victims in any way, and they just get to skip over that piece and go straight to the accountability. But it's always presented with compassion, right? That is very much a necessary piece. So the topics are quite extensive. When we bought an original program, it was 15 weeks, which was too long. And we adapted it, I immediately adapted it to 12 sessions. The first 2 weeks are spent talking about accountability and amends making, and the human versus the legal consequences of crime. So offenders typically are very concerned about the legal consequences of crime because those are the ones that are really obvious to them, right? I had to pay a lawyer, I had to go through the court process, and now I'm doing this time, and I don't really get what that does for anybody. Versus the human consequences of the suffering, the ripple effect of your crime, not just what it means for your victim, but also what it means for your own family. So in the very first week, one of the exercises that You Have the Power suggests, and which I have found incredibly powerful, is I play a victim impact statement for them, and then I have one person represent the victim side, and one person represent the offender's side, and then we have the participants name everybody who's been affected by this crime on both sides. So on the victim side, there's the direct victim, and then how do their family feel about that crime, and how do the medical professionals who had to deal with them feel about that crime, and what is it costing the taxpayers to have the court procedure, and so on. And so you end up with this huge circle all around the victim who's affected. And then when you go to the offender side, what has this done to your mom and your siblings and your extended family? What has this done for the prejudice against your particular ethnic community, if that's an identifying factor for you, if your experience is racialized? What has it done for the people in your neighborhood, that one more father is gone from the community? What does it mean for your children, and so on? And we run out of bodies in the room, right, to put around these two sides about who is affected. So that's the very first week, and it really illustrates the human consequences, and it really gets people engaged. I then decided to talk about drug dealing and addiction next, because any of you who are familiar with prison culture probably know that drug dealers think they have customers, and sex offenders have victims. So we really need to get at that right away, because unless we bring the drug dealers down a couple of ego notches, we're not going to end up having an effective conversation as we move through the material, right? Too much pecking order stuff. And it has been very, very, very powerful for the men who are there for drug offenses to understand, even if they don't get how the people they deal to are victims, they do see through the material that's presented how those people's children are affected, and they certainly understand how their own children are affected by their incarceration, or their own moms and dads and so on, right? And then we move into child abuse, domestic violence, driving under the influence, property crime, gang and hate crime, elder abuse, sexual assault, and murder. And the newer version from What You Have the Power has a chapter on forgiveness, which I was really glad to see them add. And what the men notice, the big learning for the participants as they go through the various topics, is that actually there's a lot of common ground between crimes. So it's quite shocking to them to hear how somebody who has suffered a property crime reports post-traumatic stress symptoms. They report an inability to trust people. They report an inability to move on with their lives because of the loss of income, or the financial suffering that has been created, but also how that creates emotional suffering. They're very interested to examine how, there's lots of thieves who think they're sticking it to the man when they steal from Walmart, but then when we talk about how Walmart accounts for that and puts those costs onto the other legitimate customers at Walmart, you're not really sticking it to the man, right? You're sticking it to the other people who are just fighting to feed their families. Making those kinds of connections for people is very powerful. They just see things in a really different way. So they're quite shocked. They tend to think of maybe women and children as the only victims of crime. And to see the commonalities across the spectrum is really, it's just really important to them. And it's funny, by about the third crime, when I say to people, how are they affected, they just start sticking up their hands and saying PTSD. Like, that kind of covers, in some way, the whole blanket, right? So that is, I'm sorry, again, that's quite shocking to them. I really want to add a new piece for the Canadian content, which is electoral fraud, but I'm going to have to find somebody to help me write that chapter, because I think the consequences are going to be hard to describe. We should get on that. Anyway, the curriculum was very American, right? You would expect that. It's an American organization. Of course, the laws in sentencing, the criminal definitions are different in the States. And the sentences are very different in the States. And sometimes the non-sex offenders would take a lot of comfort hearing how much longer sex offenders are jailed for in the US and so on. So that was always an interesting discussion, or is always an interesting discussion. But I tried to Canadianize it right away. I kind of self-imposed some CRTC regulations, and the men were really interested in that. They wanted to make sure that we were dealing with accurate criminal definitions, and also that we were talking about how and why sentencing works the way it does in Canada, right? Very, very rich conversations about that. And the guys actually signed right up to help me. So a couple of guys went to the library, looked up all the criminal code definitions, did some research about the sentencing. One guy went to the school and asked if he could put a PowerPoint presentation together so that I'd have some AV for the material. Like, really, they were just so invested. And then the things that I was able to do was add Canadian stories that better reflect the situation in Canada. So obviously there's lots of pieces in the news that we can talk about, and victim impact statements that have been published, or sometimes victims who had testified at parole hearings inside would be willing to have those redacted and shared with the group. So we did all of those kinds of things. And I've always been careful to pick stories that illustrate, as the curriculum does an excellent job of picking stories that illustrate the unintended consequences of crime. So I tell a story about my own mom where she was mugged and the person thought that he was just stealing her purse, but in fact he was stealing her life-saving medication. And the things that happen that you don't think are going to happen. It's the armed robbery that goes wrong. Obviously we all think we're going to get away with the stuff we're going to try in life, and when things go wrong, they go terribly wrong. So using those kinds of stories, which often the men could really relate to illustrate how much more harm they're doing than they think that they're doing. From the first run of my first run of the program, it was really important for me to weave forgiveness into the material. I'm an RJ person, so a restorative justice person, so obviously that's where I come from. But there are two pieces about that are really important. And one is because so many of the offenders are victims. And if they're not victims, they often have co-accused that they're quite angry with. And any effort to lay the blame on other people and focus on other people's responsibility in the situation prevents them from accepting accountability for that, right? I wouldn't be here if that guy hadn't rolled over on me. Actually, you wouldn't be here if you hadn't been there in the first place, right? It has less to do with that guy who rolled over on you or ratted you out than it does with your own participation in that situation. It's a very challenging thing for prisoners to be confronted with that, but incredibly important. And the other thing is then many human beings have this sense that as long as we're angry with somebody, we're punishing them. But the reality for most of us is that we don't know who's mad at us, and it doesn't affect us in a lot of ways, but probably many of you know that saying that the resentment is the poison I drink hoping somebody else is going to die. And putting that on a bulletin board in a room full of angry people, it's really can be quite a powerful thing to ask them to digest some of that. So I personally feel that forgiveness is an important part of helping them to move forward. I also, as my bio mentioned, I really like to talk about post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic stress disorder is obviously a very real thing and a very serious thing. But I heard a victim yesterday, what did she say? I put my pain to purpose. I put my pain to purpose. And that idea that it's possible to turn a really awful thing into a really good thing, personally, I think that's important. I think that's something that we can offer to the victim population to help them get unstuck. And actually, it's also something we can offer to the offender population, right? It doesn't matter which side of the equation we're on. Chinese saying crisis is an opportunity. It's very important to present some kind of hopeful message. But I'm also very, very clear with the participants that just because post-traumatic growth exists doesn't mean you can force that on your victims, right? We don't get to pick other people's outcomes for them. We can only, chart our own direction. So while I talk about post-traumatic growth, I'm very clear with them that this is not a common outcome and not something that they can comfort themselves with, right? Something they can work towards for themselves, but not something that they can use to minimize the impact of their crime.